The end of the use of Alcatraz as a federal penitentiary ironically came about in large part because of the prison's most famous moment, the escape of inmates Clarence Anglin, John Anglin, Frank Morris in June of 1962. After the months-long search for the escaped prisoners was abandoned, leaving the fate of the prisoners either as victims of drowning in the San Francisco Bay or else the masterminds of the greatest escape in the history of American prisons, the public's attention turned towards finding a scapegoat to blame for the escape. Naturally, the man who received the brunt of this criticism was the warden of the prison, Olin Blackwell. But Warden Blackwell had his own scapegoat to cast blame upon for the breakout. He decided to shift the responsibility for the disaster onto a target that couldn't fight back, and that was Alcatraz prison itself. Blackwell saw the poor state of Alcatraz as his best way to cast off his own failures as warden. He blamed the conditions of Alcatraz for the escape, saying that buildings on the island were suffering from, quote, erosion and debilitation. He pointed to an engineering survey that had been completed just a year prior, which had disclosed that the prison buildings were dangerously deteriorated. Following the warden's statements, the mayor of San Francisco, a man named George Christopher, decided that the rock had reached its final days. Less than a year after the escape of the Anglins and Frank Morris, Alcatraz Island would be shut for good. Here's the story of the final day at Alcatraz and what it looked like as the last group of prisoners crossed Broadway for one final time. Now, while Blackwell might have seen the conditions of Alcatraz as a convenient way to cast off blame for the notorious escape that had happened right under his nose, he wasn't wrong about the horrible conditions that the prison had fallen into by the time it reached its final days. For decades, the prison had faced a combination of slow decay and escalating operational costs. Because of how isolated Alcatraz was, the price of just running the prison's day-to-day operations had become shockingly steep. The main problem was that in order to supply anything to the island, it needed to be shipped in by boat, which was extremely expensive. This even included drinking water, as over 1 million gallons of fresh water had to be supplied by barge to the island every week. While the average prison at the time cost about $3 per prisoner per day to run, Alcatraz was costing nearly $10 a day. This made it 3 times more expensive to keep the prisoners at Alcatraz than anywhere else in the country. But the rising expenses of the rock weren't just its operational costs. Due mostly to the erosion caused by the salt spray off the Pacific, all of the structures that held up the prison itself were crumbling, and the structure of the prison had fallen into such poor conditions that a choice needed to be made between extensive renovations or total abandonment. Concrete walls were falling to pieces and huge chunks could be chipped away with nothing more than a fingernail. The electrical systems had decayed and made the risk of fire dangerously high. Even the catwalks from which the guards monitored the prisoners were in danger of crashing down at any moment. It had become clear that if renovations were not made, the prison might become a hazard, not just to the inmates who were held within its walls, but also to the guards who had to maintain order on the island. There was also concern that the prison might not be able to withstand a potential earthquake, which was a real risk considering the location of Alcatraz was right near the San Andreas fault line, which causes, of course, regular earthquakes in the region. All of these problems were not new to the men who ran Alcatraz. Back in 1958, engineers had tried to take on some of the much-needed repairs, but as they dug into the structural problems, it became clear that the scale of the deterioration was even greater than anyone realized. The engineers in charge of the project estimated that the cost to repair the prison would total nearly $4 million, and it would take at least 5 years of work to complete the repairs. And faced with these extreme costs to repair an already out-of-date prison, the decision became easy. Alcatraz had to be closed sooner rather than later. But before the cell door could be shut for the final time, an important decision had to be made. Now the question was where exactly the prisoners, some of whom were considered among the most dangerous men in America, could be held once they left the rock. The answer to this question actually came from an interesting source. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of JFK, who would see his brother assassinated in 1963 and eventually be killed by an assassin himself in 1968, Robert Kennedy came up with plans for a replacement to Alcatraz. He proposed that rather than sending the most dangerous criminals to a place of extreme isolation like the rock had been, a new facility needed to be built which would be centralized to the entire nation. The location he proposed as the replacement was in the city of Marion, Illinois. The new facility was to be completed by 1963, the same year that Alcatraz closed. Interestingly, this facility built in Marion would carry on the Alcatraz legacy of housing some of America's most fascinating and notorious criminals. During its years of operation, it's held everyone from the gangster John Gotti, who was head of the Gambino crime family, to the Russian arms dealer Victor Bout, who was known as, quote, the Merchant of Death, and released last year in a prisoner swap for WNBA player Brittany Griner, and it's evenly held briefly the disgraced baseball star Pete Rose. And the same legacy that The Rock built itself upon for holding famous men like Capone and Whitey Bulger seemed to be passed on to its replacement. With an adequate new facility under construction, the work of emptying out Alcatraz began on September 10th, 1962, when the first group of 6 prisoners were permanently transferred to the prison at Leavenworth. Over the next 6 months, regular transfers took place as Alcatraz gradually emptied out its population and prepared to close. Finally, on March 21st, 1963, The Rock reached its final day. The press were invited to the facility to witness the last transfer, and its closing turned out to be a day that nobody present would ever forget. Now, this is a photograph of the prisoners shuffling out of Alcatraz on that final day. By the time the prison was ready to shut down its doors for good, the number of prisoners still living inside the facility had dwindled from more than 200 down to a mere 27. On the morning of March 21st, 1963, the last group of prisoners woke up. Included in this final group was an inmate named Frank Weatherman. He had only been transferred to Alcatraz a year earlier after he had attempted to escape from a prison in Alaska. Weatherman was a gun runner, and by pure chance, he would become immortalized as the final prisoner to walk off Alcatraz Island. It was not a typical morning during those final hours of The Rock's operations. One of the biggest changes from the usual procedure was the media and photographers that had flocked to witness the historic day. Normally, reporters were not allowed on the island for safety reasons. However, on this day, more than 250 journalists of all types lined up as the final men were walked down Broadway for the last time. Among these journalists was a renowned photographer for Life magazine named Lee Weiner. Over a 5-decades-long career, Weiner had photographed everyone from JFK and Marilyn Monroe to Pope John Paul II Willie Mays. 4 of his photographs hang in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. On this day, Weiner arrived to immortalize those last hours at Alcatraz. His pictures, the majority of which were not published until after his death, capture the isolation of those final hours on the island. After the inmates were awoken by the morning bell, they were fed a final breakfast, and the process of preparing them to leave Alcatraz began. This included subjecting the men to a thorough strip search to make sure they weren't hiding any weapons that might be used in an escape attempt during their transfer. After the search, the inmates were given new clothes and chained with leg irons, belly chains, and handcuffs. With the prisoners thoroughly secured, they took their last march across Broadway, across the yard, down the gangway, and finally onto the ferry waiting to carry them off the island. To the very last moments, the security at Alcatraz was never relaxed, as guards with rifles still watched over every movement of the prisoners, eager to make sure nobody tried anything on that last day. And at last, the final group of men crossed the gangway and stepped onto the boat that would carry them away from the Rock for good. The ferry that took them away from the island was a T-451, which was a converted transfer vessel from the Korean War. It was named after the last man who had run the prison. It was christened on her bow, said, quote, Warden Blackwell. While everyone agreed that Alcatraz needed to be closed due to its deteriorating conditions, not all the prisoners were actually happy to leave the island. In many cases, the places they were transferred to, places like Leavenworth, were more crowded than Alcatraz, and prisoners would have to share cells as opposed to the single cells of the Rock. The guards also felt the emotional weight of that final day, as they were leaving a place that many of them had called home for years. The last guard to step foot on the boat leaving Alcatraz was a guard named Jim Albright, who wrote about his personal feelings in those final moments. He said this, quote, I boarded the boat for the last time as a guard on Alcatraz. I thought to myself what an experience I had just completed, and how fast the time went by. I felt tears grow in my eyes as the boat went across the water to Fort Mason, end quote. As we mentioned, the last prisoner to step off the island, marking the official end of Alcatraz as a federal penitentiary, was Frank Weatherman. But he had a much different opinion on life on the Rock. As he stepped onto the transfer vessel and reporters gathered around him to ask his thoughts on leaving Alcatraz, he summed them up in a single sentence to the press. He said, quote, Alcatraz was never no good for nobody. After 29 years of holding the most notorious and dangerous men in America, Alcatraz officially closed once weathermen stepped onto the last boat leaving the island. The San Francisco Chronicle eulogized that strange final day and what it meant for the iconic prison. They said this, quote, "Alcatraz, the grimiest symbol in North America of the hard hand of justice, is a prison no more. It's just a crumbling piece of federal real estate."